The future of the reboot trilogy of The Exorcist is now looking uncertain, but the problems it's currently facing are revealing a harsh truth about 2018's big horror revival. The horror genre has been going through a trend of reboots and requels that have been used to bring back some of the genre's most popular and profitable franchises. While some have succeeded, as is the case of the Scream franchise, this formula hasn't had the same effect in all horror franchises that have tried to make a comeback with it. Among the most recent franchises that joined the requel trend is The Exorcist, which was revived with the 2023 movie The Exorcist, Believer. Directed by David Gordon Green, The Exorcist, Believer is a direct sequel to William Friedkin's 1973 horror classic and follows Victor Fielding, Leslie Odom Jr., a photographer who is forced to confront the nadir of evil when his daughter Angela and her friend Catherine show signs of demonic possession. Unfortunately, The Exorcist, Believer wasn't the exciting return to the franchise that viewers expected, making the future of the trilogy uncertain while also bringing to light the tough truth of the 2018 horror revival that made The Exorcist, Believer possible. The success of 2018's Halloween led to the Exorcist Trilogy plans. Halloween was successfully revived in 2018. Possessed children in The Exorcist Believer. The Exorcist, Believer and the trilogy plans that came with it were possible thanks to the success of the Halloween reboot trilogy. In 2018, Blumhouse brought the Halloween saga back to life with a requel simply titled Halloween. Directed by David Gordon Green and written by Jeff Fradley, Danny McBride, and Green, Halloween is a direct sequel to John Carpenter's 1978 movie of the same name, thus ignoring all sequels and timelines that came after it. This allowed the writers to bring the saga's final girl, Laurie Strode, Jamie Lee Curtis, back with a new story in which she wasn't related to Michael Myers, but their traumatic encounter on Halloween night, 1978, deeply affected Laurie for the rest of her life. Halloween was a critical and commercial success, with critics praising Green's direction, Curtis' performance, and the movie's darker tone, which made it easier for the studio to move forward with two sequels. The success of Green's Halloween was highly influential in the horror genre as it proved that a dead horror franchise could be revived, and inspired the revival of other horror franchises, such as Candyman in 2021, Scream, which also planned a reboot trilogy, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, even if not all of them succeeded. The Exorcist, Believer is also a result of Halloween 2018's success, and even followed the same formula by being a direct sequel of the first movie and retconning the sequels, with David Gordon Green directing and co-writing along with McBride and Scott teams. Everything that went wrong with The Exorcist's new trilogy plans. The Exorcist, Believer was a huge disappointment. Two possessed girls are strapped to chairs and hooked up to medical equipment while a woman reads from a Bible behind them. Despite being part of a well-known horror franchise and a sequel to what's widely regarded as the best horror movie ever made, The Exorcist, Believer failed to match what made the first movie so great and scary. The Exorcist, Believer was labeled as an unnecessary sequel as it didn't bring anything new to the franchise, instead being an all-too-familiar story of demonic possession that did nothing to shock the audience. This was also a big part of the reason why The Exorcist, Believer wasn't scary as it made it predictable, and not even the return of Ellen Burstyn as Chris McNeil was worth it, as she was underused and her role was, ultimately, underwhelming and disappointing. Despite earning back its production budget and becoming the highest-grossing Exorcist movie since Friedkin's movie, grossing a total of $137 million, The Exorcist, Believer is considered a flop due to the $400 million that the studio paid for the distribution rights to the franchise. The bad critical reception and box office numbers cast a shadow over the future of the Exorcist reboot trilogy, despite two sequels confirmed to be in development since 2021, with The Exorcist, Deceiver, planned for an April 2025 release. The future of the Exorcist reboot trilogy is now more uncertain after Green stepped down from Deceiver and the movie was removed from the release schedule.